So once again, warm welcome, Neil, uh, and everybody else. Also, Neil, just a short introduction. Neil Douglas Klutz is a renowned writer, teacher, and artist, musician, and also in the fields of Middle Eastern spirituality and the translation and interpretation of the ancient Semitic languages of Hebrew, Aramaic, and Arabic. And Neil is a frequent speaker and workshop leader. He is the
Mhm.
author of the several books, including Prayers of the Cosmos, The Hidden Gospel, Revelations of the Aramaic Jesus, and his upcoming new book, the Aramaic Jesus Book of Days. So, just a short introduction, but Neil, thank you very much for joining us and warm welcome.
Thank you, Yossi. Thank you for inviting me. I'm sorry
Uh,
we had to cancel last time, but
no
anyway, I'm
problem.
glad we're here now.
Yes, very nice. Oh, wait a minute, I'll put this view a little bit different. So we have the speakers. All right. Uh, Maybe we can begin that, Neil, if you can, because the topic today is the Aramaic Jesus and non-dualism. Maybe you can give us a short introduction on how this Aramaic Jesus came in your life and how you found it, and then
Ah,
we can go on from that.
okay, we can do that. Then you know
Thank
who's speaking to you.
you. Thank you.
Well, I was raised in the U.S. I mean, I've lived in Scotland for 25 years now, but I was raised in a small town in the Midwest, and my parents were not interested in traditional religion in any sense. They were more interested in the early ecological movement in the U.S. This was in the 1950s, so that from Rachel Carson, who wrote the book Silent Spring, which was very important in the U.S. at that time. And my parents were also involved in the organic gardening movement. In addition, my father was an early chiropractor, an alternative physician uh, in Illinois, and that was still quite radical at that time. And then finally, they were involved in psychic study groups uh, through the work of this American psychic whose name was Edgar Cayce. Many of your folks may not have heard of him, but he was also very important. He channeled various remedies and things like that. So my brothers and I were raised on this sort of inner family culture. But because my father had to work in this small town in the U.S., in Illinois, we were sent to quite traditional Christian elementary schools uh, so that we would appear more normal. Uh, and at this school, I had to learn large parts of the King James translation of the Bible and a lot of Christian theology and memorize thousands of words from Martin Luther in his what's called his small catechism. You probably know about that in
Yeah.
Finland. So, I was raised on this very conservative interpretation of Lutheranism. Uh, and uh, and so that helped train my memory, and also I memorized large parts of the Bible in the standard translations. But I had many questions even as a child, and those sorts of questions are not answered when you ask the church officials. Like, supposedly it says in the Lord's Prayer, what they call the Lord's Prayer, uh, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Well, why would God lead you into temptation? I mean, many children have this question, but they're either told to shut up or go stand in the corner or something. Basically, is sort of what my experience was. So, when I finally left home and went to university, I went as far as I could from this sort of Christianity that I knew, and I became more involved in social action, protest against the Vietnam War, and then in my early work as an investigative reporter. And I was investigating particularly some of the areas that I knew from my family life, the food and drug, you could say, industry, because that was very, we knew about that. My father was being persecuted by them all the time, and the early ecological movement. So I was, researching what was going on in the US government at that time with these things. And this was still the 1970s. So this is quite early, 50 years ago now.
Mhm.
So I was doing this. I was working eventually for an alternative so-called underground news service where we syndicated all these stories to about 600 independent newspapers across the US. This is when we still had these independent newspapers.
Yeah.
But I burned out from this after about, you know, 3, 4 years. I was working 60, 70 hours a week, and, you know, nothing seemed to be changing, and
Mm.
people didn't seem to respond to being told the facts of what's going on.
Mm.
And so I had to ask myself, well, do you always listen to facts before you make major decisions in your life? And I had to answer no. To myself, honestly, no, I don't use facts when I make major decisions. Usually I don't have the facts. So then on what basis do I make major decisions in my life? And this, of course, leads to the question of, as you'll all be familiar with, who am I?
Yeah.
Who is this person making these decisions?
Mhm.
And so I looked into different types of meditation and things like this. There was not that much available in the 1970s in the US. There were various Hindu gurus. Um, there wasn't all that much Buddhism, really. There was some. And eventually ended up studying with the Sufis
Mhm.
in California. And they were very much involved in chanting, in a type of meditation, um, particularly with the mysticism of sound, where you're intoning certain words. And so, uh, because I had a publishing background, I was editing the letters of you could say, the founder of this particular branch of Sufism, which was very much into singing and dancing mantras and things like that. And he wrote that before he died, he wanted to learn to pray the Lord's Prayer in Aramaic, as he wrote. And that struck me for a moment because it would make sense that if you were going to chant words from Jesus, you would chant them in his native language, which Aramaic was.
Yeah.
So I began to research, try to find out, okay, what is Aramaic, who knows Aramaic, all this, on and on. And I found someone, or a Jewish rabbi, who helped me. And I started to chant an initial version. You could say I was sounding out the sounds, basically. In my birth family, I had been raised hearing different languages, not just English, but German and Polish and Yiddish and a little bit of Russian, because I came from an immigrant family.
Mhm.
So learning another language didn't seem that difficult for me,
Yeah.
even if it was an ancient language that I didn't even know if anyone spoke this language anymore.
Mm.
So I began to do that, and I began to have very, how do we call them now, spiritual experiences, we would call that. Um, Experiences where my body began to make movements that wasn't aware of where they came from. I was hearing sounds, things like this, these sorts of experiences. And so I received, because it was in some sort of meditation, on a long retreat, I received melodies for Jesus' prayer in Aramaic because I was chanting them. And I thought, well, maybe this is just for me. It could be, you know, it can be. Sometimes those things are. But then, there seemed to be a clear direction, a voice that said, well, share this with other people. And without getting too messianic about the whole thing, like I'm the new Messiah, which I knew was not that, I began to share some of this with other people. And gradually, it got to be more. And then I'll just end it here. But then about, when was it? Wasn't that long after that. About 5 years later, I went to work in an institute, a university institute, for a man by the name of Matthew Fox, who was you could call him the founder of creation spirituality. He wouldn't call himself that, but he was a radical at that time Dominican priest who founded an institute for people to revive their spirituality. And on the basis of what he called original blessing rather than original sin. So original sin was not in the Bible. That's quite clear. So he found original blessing in the Bible. So it was all based on that. So I was his Sufi person. He had scientists, he had people from Wicca, from the pagan tradition, from Buddhism, all sorts of different people. We worked together, and students came to our institute from all over the US, primarily, sometimes from other countries as well. So Matthew Fox encouraged me to do more research in Aramaic properly, you could say academic research, and then to publish a book about this,
Yeah.
which is what I did. And this was initially published in 1990, this original book that it was called Prayers of the Cosmos at the time. So that was really the start of all of this.
Yeah. Today's topic, we're talking about non-dualism and this Aramaic Jesus
Yeah,
combination. And as we already mentioned, that who am I is the key word, practically whatever
yeah,
practices, spiritual practices you do. And from our point of view, okay, like I said, we have this Ramana Maharshi idea of self-investigation. So what it is just to direct attention inward to our core, to the source, where this I seems to come up. What is this I? Where does it come from? And it's not so far-fetched if we think about Nicodemus and Jesus, go back to where you came from idea.
yes,
And so that seems to be one example. But also this, so many places Jesus talks about this I am, and etc. And this I is very important. And that I, okay, we can think that it's one person, a certain Jesus who talks about I, but we all have the I. We all feel that I exist, I am. So it must relate to us also, otherwise it means nothing to us if it's not, if it
sure.
doesn't concern us. So that was the main interest, and that's how I got to this idea that now it's wonderful to find from our own tradition a new way of seeing Jesus's words, which come from this Aramaic, especially, and they give a totally new meaning, almost opposite meanings. And so, but how is it? Can you say what's the non-dualistic point of view, if you can say it, in if you look through Aramaic glasses? I mean, because nobody's teaching this normally in churches or priests,
No,
so there's no non-dualistic approach. But clearly, I've heard that there's many scholars and even academics who think that there is similarities in Jesus' teaching.
y yes, there is definite similarity. There's no
Yeah,
question. The thing is, my work is, I used you could say, a very narrow entry point, which was language.
yeah,
And I have to give a bit of background. That involved me learning basically all of the ancient Semitic languages. That is ancient Hebrew, not the Hebrew in the synagogue today, and also even up into classical Arabic, which was the Arabic through which the Quran came to Muhammad.
mm,
And in all of these ancient languages, there is a particular worldview, a way of looking at the world. There's a particular way of knowing. In other words, how does one know anything?
mm,
Scholars call that way of knowing epistemology, which is a big fancy word.
mm,
But basically, if you look at language, you find your way back to the ancient way of understanding ourselves in the world.
mm,
And what seems to be the case in most languages, not just these ones I've studied, but almost even including Western languages, is that 10, 20, 30, 100,000 years earlier, we had very little sense of an individual self. Now, I'm not the only person to point this out.
mm,
For instance, Rudolf Steiner goes into this also as well, and other authors.
yeah,
I forgot the name of the French scholar who does the same. But basically, very ancient humanity, before stories, before religions, before scriptures, before any of this, had very little sense of self. We were as though embedded in our environment, in nature. And nature was not nature there and me here, but nature was like the clothing that I wear around my naked body.
mm,
So I felt it as part of myself. I mean, it wasn't my skin, but when someone touches my arm, my clothing, I feel that they're touching me.
mm,
So that's the what we would call the body awareness, the somatic sensation, because I studied somatic psychology for a while. So anyway, it was more like that. And in terms of our inner life, we humanity had very little inner life because our inner life we felt on the outside. So that means also that the way we viewed each other and nature was not the way we do today, but it was more in a sort of dreamlike state of consciousness. Now, gradually, over thousands and thousands of years, and we can trace this through the use of language, humanity develops a more individualized sense of their self. And different religions talk about this, different creation stories talk about this in different ways. When is this rise of the human individual consciousness? Where does it come from? You know, this is a key question. Before I ask who am I have to ask who am I 100,000 years ago, basically. So there is, I mean, you have to accept if you're going to go with this ancient point of view, and also with my work, that there was an evolution of human consciousness from very little self to now very extreme amounts of individual self. But at the same time, before we had very little sense of freedom, of choice. And now we have extreme amounts of freedom and choice. So you could say it's not just terrible that we now have this very, you could say, egotistical, self-oriented consciousness, which is a big problem in the world, but also most people, most of us would value this sense of freedom, of choice that we have. These are taken for granted. So the question is, can we still have this freedom of choice and still feel ourselves more embedded, choose to feel more embedded with each other, connected with each other, connected with the cosmos in this more unitive way? Now there's a long way around saying, for the ancients and for Jesus, it is a sort of both and, but it's not one or the other. And in order to be in the both, you have to sort of stand in the middle. So again, I'll give a model. This is a picture, but remember, it's only a picture that I'm giving you, I'm giving us now, I'm giving myself now. And before, these pictures were not needed. What we find in Aramaic is two breaths, as you'll know, you'll see from your reading of my book.
Yeah.
Two breaths. One is the individualized breath that is held in this body, flesh, as Jesus would call it, for the number of years that I am here. And also this larger breath, shall we call it, of which I am a part. The individualized breath has a name called nafsha, which is more sound-wise, somatically focused here in body awareness, and ruha, which is a more round sound, a more open sound, which is all around us. So it's not just the air we're breathing, but there is you could say, there's a breath part of my being. And in the Eastern traditions, they might call this the pranic self, the self that is prana, essentially. But as you know, also in Sanskrit, prana can be translated as breath, but it's also life energy. So the ancient Aramaic is not that much different. We have ruha and we have nafsha. So this is the individualized self, but the individualized breath is also part of that. There's where you get into the tatvamasi part. So the key in the Aramaic and in the ancient Semitic worldview, and this is what I call the view of the ancient nomads of the Middle East, of Southwest Asia, is that we're heading towards living with all of this. Your individual self does not disappear, so to speak, but it becomes sort of more transparent within this larger ruha, this larger sense of self, or what Jung would call self with a capital S. In my books, I tend to call it soul, but basically it's ruha. So this is essentially it. And then almost everything in Jesus's writings, whether in the so-called accepted books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or in the so-called Gnostic books, many of which are not really Gnostic. They just weren't included. They're not Gnostic in the strict academic sense
Yeah.
of a split between good and evil. Most of them don't have this.
Mm.
But this was what he was presenting. He was showing, look, folks, your humanity, your individual consciousness is gradually getting more and more individualized.
Mm.
So prepare for that. This is 2,000 years ago only. 2,000 years is not that long.
Yeah.
I mean, you compare to 20,000, 200,000. Humans have been around way longer than that with culture of some sort,
Mm.
but not our culture. So he's saying, look, folks, try to find out who your Ina is, who your individual I is. Connect that with the source of that. And this is where we circle back to your
Yeah.
quote of John 3 from Nicodemus. So whenever Jesus says, and it's translated, I am this, what he's saying in Aramaic is Ina, Ina, connect. If you connect this, this shows you X, Y, Z. This shows you the bread, this shows you energy, this shows you light, this shows you the way, this shows you which way to go, all these things. So keep connecting, do it that way. And then he uses different metaphors, different images for his people, many of which are drawn from nature around him. So sorry, that isn't short, but anyway, that's
Oh, no, it's
as simple
fantastic.
as I can make it.
Well, that's just what we're looking for. And what just came in my mind then, what role has God? I mean, it's Allah in this Aramaic, which is interesting as a word also. But if we think about where we are at the moment in our culture, God has been separated from us to
Yes,
beyond heavens, not even heavens, somewhere He has no part whatsoever in our life. And now we're like, and the idea, what I want to say is that we're told to love thy God with all thy heart and mind and soul. But how can we love anything that is strange to us or foreign to
yeah,
us? I
well,
bet we can't, because we can't even love our neighbor. If it's a new neighbor, I don't love him immediately. So
yeah, sure,
so we have to find something that is most close to us, and I think it's this inna, or this self, this
yeah,
nafsa or ruha connection, because that's the closest thing we have, and we should put our attention and love to this point. That's how I understand it. But unfortunately, our culture has separated, or trying to separate this totally from us, this God connection, so to
yeah.
speak.
Well, there's two factors that led to that, really. I mean, maybe more. One is uh, the overlay of Platonic philosophy
Yeah.
on the words. Now, Plato in himself can be quite profound also, there's no question, but it's really the overlay of a version of Plato's philosophy with Christianity becoming the official religion of the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
That plays a big part. So this God up in the sky, power over the father figure, all of this plays into, you could say, this, 1,000 years of Christian theology or more,
Mm.
maybe 1,500 years at least. So that's a big factor. For Jesus and for people who understood him in Aramaic, the so-called name for God, Allah, is almost like the ultimate non-duality, because al means something in Aramaic. It's like saying the or the, depending on,
Mm.
and la or lo means nothing. So
Mm.
it's something and nothing together.
Great.
The unity of that
Mm.
is reality for them. It's like it's nothingness or it's somethingness. Which is it? Well, it's a both.
Yeah.
And that's the way they experienced it. They experienced this, and that's why Jesus gives so many images from nature, as nature around them. He says, love, as you said, he says, det racham lamribak ak nafshak, love your neighbor as yourself.
Yeah.
But you have to remember, he's also saying, love your nafsha, love that small sense of yourself, the same way you love your neighbor, which is what's forgotten.
Yeah.
So sometimes the neighbor, you don't necessarily get along with your neighbor. Well, it's the same thing with the small self.
Yeah.
So what do we do with that? Well, he says use this particular form of love, and love is key, so is the heart. Detracham, detracham, an ancient word in the ancient Semitic languages. It's in ancient Hebrew, it's in Aramaic, it's in Arabic. This is the sense of just letting something stream through you as love. I don't have to think about loving a person or liking a person. But at some point, if we connect soul with self, rucha with nafsha, then there is a streaming through of love, not only for the small self, which seems sometimes intruding or like a neighbor you can't get along with, but also for the neighbor outside as well.
Yeah.
So this inside-outside sort of reflection is also in Aramaic. There's, as I've often said, there's no word that you can't separate inside and outside in ancient Aramaic. There's only one preposition, one letter really, that means both within me and among us.
Yeah.
So, and this is key for reading what Yeshua's, or hearing what Yeshua is saying in all these various Gospels.
This idea of the enemy, it's quite close, because like I think Jesus said also that make amends with your counterpart, which is our small self, like you just mentioned, because that's our closest enemy, if we can say it like that. And we don't get along with ourselves either, even so, not to mention neighbors or some foreign people or so forth. I'll ask, is there questions from anybody? Does anybody want to ask something now? This might be the good point too. Timo or Hannele or somebody, do you have something you want to ask related to these?
Can I ask?
Okay.
It was. Thank you very much. It was very, very interesting. And if we're considering the history of humanity, and you said that many thousand maybe years ago, people were like less selfish, right? I mean, in this sense that they felt themselves as something more individual. It was less. This feeling was like less. But this, for example, ancient practices of non-duality, for example, as self-investigation. I think this practices, or maybe it is just even one practice. I mean, the main. I don't know whether you agree with that or not. Of course, it's like, but I think it existed already, because it is like knowledge that is maybe the most basic knowledge. I mean, if we, for example, I know that you know Sri Ramana teachings, and his main point is that this who am I practice is the direct way, right? So I mean that it must have existed already in those days, even though I mean that to make this practice like existing, there should be this individual, like understanding this individual feeling of individual I mean, so what would you say if you understood which maybe I didn't ask clearly of this question, but I mean that if you understand, I mean, I hope you understood what I wanted to say.
Sure.
Thank you.
No, I understood perfectly. It's a good question. It depends on how far back you go, really, because my personal point of view is that most things that we currently call spiritual practices, and they are very valuable, are people remembering and trying to help people remember states of consciousness that we already experienced earlier in our human consciousness. In other words, we were losing this sense of the non-duality, you could say. And so then various practices arise, various teachers arise to help remind us of that. So these are in some ways like lifeboats. But you could say even on a more basic level, when we're born from our mother's womb, we have very little sense of self, separate from environment. Most of us cannot remember anything. A few can if you undergo hypnosis, but most people cannot remember anything before age of 2 years old. So we're sort of embedded with and within our mother, and then in our mother's atmosphere, and then gradually our individual self, how would we call it, develops, evolves, until it arises very strongly at a certain point, maybe between 2 and 3 years old. We start to develop that. And then in the normal human developmental pattern, we're meant to keep asking the sort of question that you're asking. Okay, I have this I, and I start out as a 2-year-old. Okay, I want to do this. Let me do this myself. I want to do, but we're not meant to have the consciousness of a 2-year-old when we're 50 years old. If we do, then that causes a lot of problems for people around us and for the world, which is what we see going on now. So in the normal, it's part of normal, the way humanity has developed. And I'm talking about with help from the unseen worlds. And I know you may not agree with this, that there are unseen worlds, but there are basically. Because otherwise, if you talk about a bigger reality, and we have all these different levels of consciousness here, normal waking consciousness, sleep consciousness, dream consciousness, deep sleep, all of that good stuff, then there are also other levels of consciousness in the unseen world. It's still all one, you could say, in that sense. But we're not meant to forget that there are these other levels of consciousness. And so as we develop through our human life, we're meant to keep asking, okay, what's my life about? Basically, boiling it down, who am I? You know, now, as I was saying to Jussi before we started, for the really, 100,000 years ago, people would not have been questioning what the Tat part of Tatvamasi. They understood the Tat. They were living in the Tat. What they didn't understand so well was the individual self. The thou, you could say, the thou art that part. And so the thou develops. And now it's like if you talk to your average person on the street, they think the thou is all that exists. I'm all that exists. And this material reality is all that exists. And those are the two big, I would say, delusions of our current Western culture. That only I exist and only material existence exists. If we could begin to sort of each, as we're all doing in our different ways, begin to deconstruct, take that apart, one of those two apart or both, then we'll gradually be on a better footing in terms of human consciousness, not to mention human survival. So.
I think,
Yeah, thank you. I just was thinking also that maybe since all this practice, I mean, they are still quite challenging for us, such practices.
Yes.
As we understand, in ancient days, this knowledge used to belong to people like sophisticated who like to priests or this kind of people in closed societies, in very narrow small societies, so or communities of they only they could have access to this knowledge. For example, I think nowadays the situation remains the same. The only thing is that now everybody who want to get some knowledge, they just go to the internet and then get this knowledge, or to buy some book and so on. So I mean that, but anyway, I mean that this kind of understanding, it is the same. I mean, otherwise it would be great progress. I mean, everyone who could get this book immediately, like, got
Sure.
enlightened, and yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean that. Anyway, it needs maybe some, even though maybe these practices existed, or not maybe, I mean they existed in the past, but anyway there should be some effort anyway, some personal evolution, some like personal development to understand properly all such things. So
Sure. Yeah,
okay.
no, I agree. I mean, otherwise it just remains an abstract concept. And a lot of what is marketed as non-dualism is basically an abstract concept today.
Yeah.
It's
And
not an experience, because you can find it, as you say, all over the internet.
Mhm.
So the ideas are simple to accept. I mean, in my work, basically, I'm trying to deconstruct a lot of people's false, what they, you could say, abusive concepts that they were raised with about Jesus and what he was doing. So that's my little piece of this work. But if I look at what he's offering and what the ancients were doing, they're not just having the idea, but they're breathing, they're intoning, they're doing what we would today call embodied body-oriented practices as you could say, gradual means, as a way of traveling into this, using, you could say, temporarily the consciousness of another person to help them. So this is where you get into the aspects of transmission. If you go to a holy place, sometimes you can imbibe that wordless atmosphere where a saint sat or lived or whatever. The same with what's called mantric practice, which can also be used for self-help hypnosis, but that is rather to fall asleep rather than to wake up. But these practices can also be used to wake up in a more embodied way. And I think that's what's necessary now. Yes, before it was all, limited to monastic groups and priests and all this stuff. But Jesus speaks against this. He says the priests, they have the keys of everything, but they're not using them and they're not letting other people use them. So it's just basically the same today. Organized religion has this, you could say a more marketed spirituality has this, but they're not, how much of it is really allowing people to imbibe this? I mean, how do we end up with fundamentalist Hinduism? How do we end up with fundamentalist Buddhism? I mean, we're not even talking about Christianity and then Islam or fundamentalist Judaism. All these organized religions have their fundamentalistic and now more and more politicized aspects. So people are just like saying, forget about all that, So, that's bad news for the world and also somewhat good news because people then have to investigate more within themselves and trust themselves more, hopefully.
Yeah, this little in faith, which is, I think, is a good word, which we don't recognize often from Jesus' words, that we don't have the faith he has. And like I read somewhere, you said that the real translation should be that don't believe in me, but believe like me, like I
Yeah,
believe.
that's
And
right.
that's actually a game changer in itself already, because
Yeah,
that brings, I think the idea also about this, the kingdom of heaven has come closer, means what I think Olena mentioned, that before it was a private section, small group of people who kept the secrets to themselves and
sure.
didn't let anybody in except exceptional people. But nowadays, anybody can, if we want to have the love and liking to know who we are, it's open to all of us. And
It's open.
that's a big change if you think. There's still, of course, groups that have secrets, but actually it's more or less nonsense in the sense that what's the
Yeah.
biggest secret? We don't know who we are. That's the secret.
Yeah, exactly. And no one can give you that except
Yeah,
you,
yeah. Or
or you
join
can
the group
receive
and
that, or
come.
however you want to put it.
If I can, a couple of words just quickly, that actually, according to history, for example, Buddha came when priests became corrupted. I mean, that at least it is said like that, and to give people more access to this knowledge. And then when, for example, when Sri Ramana came, it was already like modern society, and
Yes,
all the mass media were developing very fast and so on and so forth, and now we can see how they have developed much, and I mean, so these organized institutions, they cannot control as much as they used to, and they still control, like you said, of course, and but now there is like, it's already out of control. I would even say that
yeah,
if you want, you can really like get this knowledge. So I mean that these people, they come in proper time when certain
yes.
circumstances were created, and and they come to help like Jesus also.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think
Thank you.
also Jesus's teachings are so modern and demanding. If we think about to be even pure in our hearts, which I mean in our thoughts, and this, like you say, this shallow part of the heart, this where the thoughts come from, like you said,
Yes.
all the bad thoughts come from the heart. So not just the commanding that don't do this, don't do that, don't do this.
Yeah.
Very dynamic. Do this. Love thy God with all thy heart. Love thy neighbor as yourself, and so forth. And it's like a dynamic doing more than just denying. Don't do anything practically, just in case. And so uh, somehow that fits nowadays even better because people want to do how to practice, what to do, how can I change my life, and so forth. And it's a
Yeah.
really dynamic modern teaching, and it's a pity that it's been somehow I feel neglected. Hopefully, it's coming up back again a little more with your work also, so we get this idea that hey, it's still valuable right now. It's not old teachings.
Yeah, and I think, part of what my work has been about is that, it's for many people that come, that sort of that I've been working with, I mean, they were abused by these certain concepts that they received from religion in childhood.
Yeah.
And so, now they're, once they're freed of some of that baggage, they can see and they can go more clearly in their lives on their own path, whatever that might be.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, what you've got is you've got a Western culture that knowingly or unknowingly, even in its secular sense, is based on this sort of Christian foundation. People are imagining some utopia in the future, which is like, will be heaven on earth. Well, instead of heaven in the sky, you're going to have heaven on earth, which is some new world order. Or, all these sorts of ideas, don't think, just believe what we tell you. Don't feel, believe what we tell you. Stay apart from one another. These are all things that were going on at Jesus's time too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, I want to say something.
Yeah, go ahead.
Lasse Carlson, yeah. It's one thing that you were talking about was this to love your neighbor and also love oneself. But many people don't really understand what to love oneself means, actually. They think it's something selfish we are talking about. But I should say the most important thing is to accept and to know yourself. That's the real love towards oneself. And this thing is it's really forgotten or not understood. And it's very important because if you can't accept and look at yourself as you are not able to love another person. I mean, this is it's twofold. And the other thing I was thinking about is that the conscious, we think that, okay, it has been some, especially in Jesus' time, there were certain groups, priests and other, that were able to understand this but didn't use it. But I think there has been an evolution in consciousness, and we have a very good consciousness in mass today in the world. So we have a lot of people that can understand these things without that you were talking about,
Yes.
without any church and things. And that's the difference compared to Jesus' times, that there has been, we could say, some positive development about the consciousness and or
Yes.
especially in the vastness of it. So it's just a question of to get people to start to understand this thing. Of course, you can take information about this. You don't need the church. You don't need to go to mosque or something like that. Yes, that was what I had to say. Very interesting.
Thank you, Lars. Yeah, I would tend to agree that people are now perhaps really able to receive this now uh, than they were earlier. I mean, C.G. Jung says something actually quite similar, that, and he was also part of, you could say, in his more profound books, this is talking about Jung, like the Red Book and, Answer to Job and these sorts of things, he very much was was tracing this, you could say, this evolution of human consciousness, so that humanity will gradually come to a place where these things are either accepted or humanity will not survive. And I think that's an important feature. So, I mean, in Gospel of Thomas emphasizes more the way of knowledge, knowing the self, which is why it's very popular. And the Gospel of John tends to emphasize more the way of love, but really they have both in them. So they sort of go together. You can't know yourself without some sort of love and devotion to yourself, and you can't love yourself without knowing who you're loving more and more. And if you love a person, you want to get to know them more and more. Otherwise, it's not real love.
Mhm. That's exactly the same that Ramana Maharshi says, that the love is the power and the food which takes us to know ourselves. Because if we don't love to know ourselves, then it can't happen. That it's more than intellectual knowledge. It's the love that takes us to this knowledge of who we are. And that's also why, especially in the West, Jesus's teachings have been popular since the hippies from 60s and so forth, because this love, it's a much nicer message than don't do this and don't do that commands. It's not like we don't feel it as a command. It's more something that we are willing to do. We
Yeah.
find love a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's a matter of understanding what love is, which is
Yeah.
difficult. That's
Yeah.
because,
That's another.
so Jesus uses two different words for love. One is this love your neighbor as your individual self, and the other is love your enemy. It's two different, entirely different words,
Yeah.
two
And
different procedures. So,
yeah. I don't think we can go too much into the Lord's Prayer, but maybe we can go the first couple of words. And if you can provide us with some mantra or some kind of a short thing for us to, we can practice later on by ourselves also in our meetings. That would be nice if it's okay for you.
yeah, it's good for me. I can do that. I'm set up for that.
Okay.
It's probably the best idea, actually. Um, it's as we were talking about before we began, these sorts of words in translation are repeated often, in the churches without much feeling or
Mm.
sort of as a compulsion, you could say. At least that's the way I learned it as a child.
Yeah.
There is still some feeling that people get even from the translated words if they look within, so to speak, as we
Yeah.
would say. So I'm not saying that that's not possible. It does happen.
Mm.
I run into people all the time who have these sorts of experiences outside of the church, beyond the church, in the church. They can have these deep experiences.
Yeah.
So what Jesus says in the first two words of the prayer, which are usually translated in English as Our Father, which art in heaven. So the usual translation gives you this idea of some being sitting up in heaven somewhere. The Father, it's the ultimate Father figure.
Yeah.
But what Yeshua says is Awun Diba Shmaya. Awun Diba Shmaya. These very open oo and ah sounds. So the Awun is as though the breath is coming into us from underneath us and above us. It's the breath, you could say, coming in, the individualized breath coming into our bodies, our flesh. And they settle around here, ooh, in the heart, in terms of a body awareness. Aramaic and the ancient Semitic languages do not have a word for mind. They do not have a word for mind. They only have a word for heart. Where thoughts are, and actually even emotions, are sitting on the surface of that heart. This is their way of feeling it, viewing it. The brain was not anything in these times. We even see that in the ancient Egyptians, who, for the pharaohs, for the elite, they saved the heart and they threw the brain away when they were doing them. You're not going to need the brain in the afterlife. You only need your heart so that it can be weighed. Is it too heavy? Is it too, so that's how it was. Yeah, I'm just So this is all part of a thing. So the wound comes into the heart, and then the heart opens like this, like in a circle all around us. Diba Shemaya. Diba Shemaya. This is this realm of Shem, of light, of sound, of vibration, which is a translation of Shem. This is the so-called heaven. It's around us, it's above us, it's underneath us, it's surrounding us, all of that. So open yourself to that creation energy. As Jesus says in the Gospel of Thomas, have you known he says to his students, have you known the beginning? Have you come to stand at the beginning, such that you're asking about what your end will be? Well, come to stand at the beginning, and then you will know the all, and you will be the all. I mean, there's non-duality for you.
Yeah.
That same thing is found in the first line of his prayer. Avun Diba Shemaya. And it's actually giving a sort of spiritual practice we would call it body awareness, in sound, and also with the connection to him through his words. It was the practice of ancient Semitic nomads, and then earlier on, when they have prophets, prophetesses, that you could connect to a wise person, a prophet, a shaman, using the sounds of their words. So you could call that that's their version of mantra, basically.
Yeah.
But that's found throughout the ancient world, that through sound you come to vibration. Through vibration you can connect. Connect wherever you want to go. Connect to me. Connect to that person. Go through me. This is what he talks about. Don't stop with me. Don't believe thoughts about me, but have, as you were saying, have the same sense of trust, of confidence in this bigger reality that I have. And then gradually it becomes more and more until it's all connected.
Yeah.
So we'll chant a little bit, and that'll be fine.
Yeah.
And so we're chanting the words Aun, which does sound quite similar to Aum, actually, but I won't say that they're related. I don't know if they're related, actually, but these big open ah sounds gradually coming ooh, and then anchoring, you can see not anchoring, but embodying from underneath us. Aun, rising back into the heart, and then Diba Shemaya. So the movements that I received all those years ago, and you can try them or not, is sort of gently bending over and back, Aun, Diba, and then Shemaya, and then Aun, Diba, Shemaya. So like that. So it's this sort of, and the main thing is to get the awareness out of the head into the heart, so that it's the heart leading, even if you're making very small movements, which are often better than large ones. Aun, Diba, Shemaya. Aun, Diba, Shemaya. So he's intending to lead us to the feeling that all around us is this heaven realm, which means really that Allah, the name for reality, is also all around us. It's not sitting in any particular space or time. So we'll chant a little bit of that, and then, oops, this always happens here. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Oh boy. So this is the melody that came. So feel free to join with me, chant a bit if you want, or just hum along or breathe. And if you're listening on the recording, you can do the same. Aun Diba Shemaya, 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 Aun Diba Shemaya. Shemaya, Avun Deva, Shemaya, Avun Deva, Shemaya. Just feeling the sounds inside. Avun Deva Shemaya, Avun Deva Shemaya, Avun Deva Shemaya, Avun Deva Shemaya, Deva Shemaya, Avun Deva Shemaya. And we're breathing, and we're just feeling that inner sound of Avun, breathing out Deva Shemaya, letting the words fade, just letting the feeling, the sensation remain, breathing in from above us, from underneath us at the same time. As we breathe out, we're breathing out from the heart, feeling around us this realm of light, of sound, of vibration, of connection. This is the heaven of the heart. This is the way we enter into our real inheritance, which is, you could say, the inheritance of being part of nature, part of the cosmos, part of all that is around us, as well as within us. So for whatever feeling we've had from this, we affirm that this bigger reality is the real, you could say, ground of our being, which is what the word Amen actually means, which later becomes Amen. It's agreement. It's a yes. Amen, Amen, Amen. So, and let me just finish that, and I'll say all of the words of the prayer so that people have heard them at least once. And they go like this. Ahun Deva Shemaya, Nit God Shemoch, Tete Mal Kutach, Nechwe Sibianach Aikana Deva Shemaya, Afbaar Ah. Hoblan Lachama Desun Kanan Yamana, Washbuklan Chobain Wachtahin, Aikana Dapchanan Schwachen Al Hayabin, Wela Tachlan Lenesuna Ela Patsan Min Bisha, Metul de Lachemal Kuta, Wahaila Watesh Buchta, La'alam Almin. Amen. Amen. La'alam Almin. Amen. Righto. So if people want to learn, if you're attracted to that, you want to learn how to say it, you can go to my website. There's buttons you can click on. This is what I would call the proper use of technology rather than the improper use, one of the proper uses. So that's very possible.
Yeah.
But people often write me and they say, Neil, would you translate this word into Aramaic for me, or that word? I mean, I can do it if they're words Jesus said, but other than that, I mean, Aramaic is not a magic language. I mean, if any so-called sacred language were magic and could transform consciousness immediately, that would have happened already. Sanskrit, Pali, Aramaic, Arabic, Hebrew, Chinese, you know, just speaking one of these languages doesn't make you a wise person or even a very good person, as we know. So, you
Yeah,
know,
it's
it's all about what's here, what's in the heart,
yeah,
and where that leads us, really.
definitely. We're starting actually a new group. I'm checking out if it works out next month called Christ Is, and that because before that we have this silent group an hour before the meeting, so it's once a month, and the idea is that people come in. We don't talk or do anything. We just sit quiet for an hour or so. I mean, sitting or lying down on yoga mats or whatever, and then we leave without saying anything also. So we just experience silence with no agendas or anything like that. And then after that, we have already a good atmosphere created there. I hope we can start getting into this Christ is idea. And of course, basically, it's your work. So we're trying to somehow learn. And one of these things is this Jesus's prayer, which I've learned in some way at least, and talk about this because the actual prayer already is like a big subject to get into and discuss. And like you said, it's a practice in itself already. So we're starting with these things and let's see how it goes, but trying to just keep everything else out, only Jesus' words and teachings, nothing, nothing extra. So let's see if it works out great. If not, we'll keep it on Zoom or something else. But because we're physically meeting anyway, so I thought, why not try it out if there's interest?
Sounds good to me, you know.
Yeah.
As Jesus would say, "Eth fata," may the way be open for that.
Yeah,
So,
let's see how it goes. Is there any other questions from someone? Does somebody have something to ask? Now is a good time to do it. If not, I think we can close it here. And thank you very much, Neil, for this. Is extremely wonderful. And hopefully we can meet some other time also with you,
sure.
because there's a lot of topics to discuss about, especially this. I have to promote a little bit your book, this Aramaic, and your new book coming out, and which I'll keep on promoting in our own practices over here. And wouldn't be nice. And just to mention one thing, we have a summer retreat coming up in July. I'll send you email about it so we can
Hmm.
talk about that idea. It's like a new idea coming up, and
Hmm.
but it's also including this topic. So as one
good.
topic, we're trying to somehow get into it. And so, but anyway, I want to thank you, Neil. It was wonderful to have you, and thank you very much. And I wish you all
Thank
the
you,
best.
Jussi. Yeah, thanks to all of you for being here. Sure.
Thank you,
you very
everyone.
much.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
And,
very much.
thank you. Great.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thanks. Thank you, everybody, and Neil, and see you next time. Have a
See you
nice
next time.
day and
As
evening.
we say in Scotland, bye for now.
Bye for now. Yes. All right. Great.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.